This next video will focus on examples of feminist art, so the idea of promoting equality for women in artworks. This video will not cover all examples of feminist art, but a few key works that I think reflect some of these themes and the desire for equality. On the screen you see a work by Betye Saar. This is her Liberation of Aunt Jemima on the left side, and then you see a work by Judy, another feminist artist. This work is called The Dinner Party. So the idea of feminism, as I already mentioned, is equality. The definition is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. So really the whole goal is equality. However, feminism has often been given negative connotations with the idea of this movement being anti-man or promoting women above men or other groups. But the idea is equality. So it's important to emphasize that from the start. Many of these artworks are thinking about giving women more agency, giving women or allowing women to reveal the perspective of how women feel about certain things, and also to develop their own artistic styles. So we'll be thinking about that as we examine these different artworks. So our first work is Betye Saar's Liberation of Aunt Jemima, a work that was made in 1972, 4 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, which had a profound effect on Betye Saar. Betye Saar was raised in Los Angeles. She went to school at Pasadena City College, UCLA, also Cal State Long Beach. Those were some of the places she received her artistic training. She continues to keep a studio in Los Angeles, but this work was made during a time in Oakland. She was asked to create it for a community center in the Bay Area, and she had it on display for a gallery exhibit, and it really created quite a stir in 1972. So if you think of the 1970s, this is really a time of feminism. This is a time when people are thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment, this desire for women to gain more equality, and it's often called second wave feminism. So after the time of women gaining the right to vote, earlier in the century, now women are thinking about more rights, and especially the rights of women of color, women who may have been denied some of the rights of the past. And also many people, there was concern that the feminist movement of the 1970s was really geared at benefiting mostly white women. And the important thing was to think about how can we benefit all individuals. And so Betye Saar is really thinking about how can we remove certain stereotypes, how can we subvert certain stereotypes, and she's really doing that here with the Liberation of Aunt Jemima. Betye Saar is known for works that are assemblage pieces, so taking multiple materials and bringing them together. Betye Saar during this period was collecting racist imagery, so imagery of people like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Tom, the kind of imagery that continued to be shared and sold in the United States and reinforced really negative stereotypes about African Americans and reinforced some of the negative stereotypes that dated back to the 19th century and the period of slavery. And so here you can see a very dark-skinned woman, an Aunt Jemima figure, who was a notepad, and essentially this is where a pencil was supposed to go. And in this case, she's empowered her by giving her weapons instead. She's trying to liberate her. And then inside, she placed a postcard of a darker-skinned woman holding a light-skinned child. And this is perhaps commenting in both cases on the idea of African-American women often being domestic assistants in white households, raising white children, or thinking about how they were essentially continuing to work in some of the difficult situations that they had always worked in, and not really escaping those occupations. So very challenging circumstances. And she's really taking that idea of these women who had their rights removed and empowering them, giving them weapons that get attention. And she gets attention for this work. It really causes a stir, as I said, because people know this figure of Aunt Jemima. She's recognizable. And so people come up and they want to see this work and look at it more closely. And it has this multi-layered interpretation. So you have the images of Aunt Jemima from the pancake batter. You have the image of this figure, the mammy, who's the notepad or the notepad holder, and then this other woman on the postcard, and then superimposed over it is this black power fist. So it's often hard to see, but hopefully you can just see it right here. You can also see this kind of cottony quality down in the bottom, which perhaps references instances of cotton and cotton cultivation among slaves in the 19th century. So there's this many layered kind of way of representing the art here that allows viewers to explore it one layer at a time. And I always like to compare Betye Saar's Liberation of Aunt Jemima to the way Aunt Jemima in the pancake batter and the syrup has changed over time. So she went from being this very dark-skinned woman who's wearing this handkerchief on her head to this more full-bodied woman, to this woman who has this glossy hair and lighter skin. So really this idea of how is she changing into the 21st century and how Aunt Jemima pancake materials have modified over time. Okay, another feminist key work would be the work of Judy Chicago, The Dinner Party, also dating to the 1970s. So again, this period of intense feminism. Judy Chicago is still known as an important female artist, important feminist artist. She still works on, for the cause of women. So both Judy Chicago and Betye Saar are still alive today. In this particular case, again, you're seeing a work that's using a variety of material or a mixed media artwork. You can see that it's made up like a true dinner party. So you have 13 place settings on each side, making up 39 place settings, plus there are 999 women's names inscribed on the heritage tile floor at the center. And then each woman, there are very important women who get these place settings, or important women according to Judy Chicago. So that's important to note. So you can see the idea of the dinner party relates to the idea that women give dinner parties. So there's kind of a gender play there. Also the idea of sacrifice. So many people see this almost like an altar, that's how this is all being presented. In addition to that, there's a certain equality to this table. There's no one seat that's at the center. And many people have said the idea of 13 on each side is very similar to the Last Supper, because you have Christ at center with his 12 apostles. But in this case, again, there's no central figure. So playing on the idea of the Last Supper, which is such a male-dominated space. Also here in this case, though, equality, also the theme of sacrifice, and also playing on the idea of women hosting dinner parties. Judy Chicago was very interested in the idea of flower symbolism and also kind of female genitalia, the symbol of female genitalia representing the woman. So if you look at these individual plates, not always, but very frequently, they seem to allude to the idea of a flower and also symbolically to female genitalia. Some women responded negatively to this, the idea that women aren't just female genitalia, that they're more than that. But Judy Chicago and other artists saw this as the symbol of women's life-giving abilities, the idea that this is a symbol of femininity, this is kind of the ultimate symbol of femininity, and so that's why she chose it for this particular series. It was made by many people. She was very good at getting lots of individuals together to work on large projects, and this includes painted porcelain, needlework. So it was a big project that involved many women who assisted her and even some men. I wanted to compare the dinner party to the work of Georgia O'Keeffe. So Georgia O'Keeffe was known for these flower paintings that some critics compared to female genitalia as well, which was something that Georgia O'Keeffe never acknowledged herself. So we don't necessarily know if that reading is correct. However, Georgia O'Keeffe does get a place setting at the dinner party. So she is commemorated at this a particular table. Virginia Woolf, the literary figure Emily Dickinson, Hatshepsut, one of the only female pharaohs in Egypt. So important historical figures are commemorated, as well as goddess figures are commemorated. One of the insults about this, in addition to the focus on genitalia, was that it was perhaps too white, again, the idea that it wasn't diverse enough. So I think if the dinner party were created again, you might see additional diversity included into the the party. Here's the place setting for Artemisia Gentileschi. So you can see it's really quite lovely in how she's engaging with some of the colors of the Baroque period, the style of the artist. So she's really using some of these colors in a quite striking way, and really thinking about what would these individuals have been interested in, what were the aesthetics that surrounded them, and how could she make each individual place setting unique. And then you can see the individual names down below. For example, you can see Lebrun here, and this is probably Vigée Lebrun, of course, the portrait artist of Marie Antoinette. So this idea of connecting people, or Rosalba Carriera, you can see her name here. So she's connecting her to different female artists from around the same time. So this artwork is very, very large. You can see 48 by 42 by 36. And so for a long time, it had no place to go. It was put on temporary exhibit in a number of museums. And then it was going to be put into a university, but there were government officials that objected to it because they saw it as pornography. Eventually, however, it was put on display in a Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, and that's where it is today. So you can continue to see this particular installation in the Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. And it's a great way to learn about these different female figures. This is a work by Sylvia Sleigh. I know it includes nudity, don't be too frightened, but the whole idea here is a very 1970s image, but the whole idea here is Sylvia is playing on the idea of the Turkish bath. And so the Turkish bath was a subject explored by the French painter Ingres, and you can see this circular work where women are in a variety of poses, and it's this composite imagined image of women bathing and their body is kind of intertwined, listening to music, and this ideal composite where very much the female form is objectified and there for the male viewer to enjoy, just kind of this feast of flesh. And so Sylvia Sleigh, about 100 years later, is playing on that idea. We can see her husband, who was an art curator and critic, in the foreground, gazing at her, and he's in this very traditional female pose, this supine nude pose, where he is reclining and he's gazing out towards her. She also included other male figures who inspired her intellectually, who were important friends. And I think it's interesting because there's a strong naturalism here too. I mean, she's not shying away from tan lines and body hair the same way that we often see in old master paintings, where there's no signs of tan lines, there's no signs of body hair. So there's a certain realism here that Sylvia Sleigh is really engaging with. So it's wonderful. It's a very clear subversion of the traditional way women are objectified. But she's not necessarily objectifying these men. These were men who inspired her. She was deeply attracted to her husband. So she's really celebrating these men as well in some ways, but clearly referencing images of the past. Also, in the 1960s, there was an artist named Alice Neel who was exploring the female body, especially pregnant women, in a way that wasn't traditionally beautiful. Her portraiture is often seen as not traditionally idealized. And so Sylvia Sleigh might have been working in some of the kind of those channels as she's exploring her subjects for the Turkish bath. And Alice Neel is also a very significant painter. So Monika Sjoo was a Swedish artist. However, she did spend a lot of time in the UK. And when she was in the UK, she created this painting of God giving birth, probably painted in 1968, actually. So let me fix that. So God giving birth in 1968. This was something she created after she had a home birth. There was a reaction to a home birth that she had of her, I think it was her second son. And so she'd given birth at home and had this moment of really connecting to the idea of the Great Mother. And the Great Mother was something that was often discussed in the 1970s, this kind of cult of the Great Mother, the idea of God as woman, the importance of women as creators, as those who give birth. And so she's really emphasizing that in this particular image. She talks about the kind of visions she had when she was giving birth, this kind of moment of communing with the Great Mother, with ancestors, and this tradition that goes back generations. So here, obviously, you see the figure that's supposed to represent God, a child emerging from her vaginal region. You can see it set within the universe with these celestial bodies up above. And then you can also just see this idea of kind of a void down at the bottom. And it's very clear, the idea of God giving birth. So it's important to note that these artists are often working in representational techniques. At this point, abstraction was so closely related to men. And so many female artists who were thinking about feminism were going away from abstraction. They weren't as interested in abstraction anymore. Monika Sjoo was also interested in the idea of making this figure both black and white, the origins of figures from Africa. She also was in a relationship with a man who had African origins around this time, so that might have affected it as well. So it was a very controversial work. When it was displayed, I think she was tried for a number of issues. I think the show was shut down, so she was in a lot of trouble for this. Here we see her with her work, God Giving Birth, and then she also wrote a book called The Great Cosmic Mother, along with Barbara Moore. The work eventually was purchased by a Swedish collection, but as I said, she did spend a lot of time in the UK. Unfortunately, this kind of work was often shut down. She actually was in the area of where Barbara Hepworth was working. Barbara Hepworth, the very important sculptor in the UK, kind of in the area of Cornwall, and she felt very little support from Barbara Hepworth or other female artists when her work, like God Giving Birth, was being heavily questioned. So it really was this very controversial work. All right, this is the work of Ana Mendieta, who was originally from Cuba, although she left at quite a young age, which may have been quite traumatizing for her. She often engages her body in work. She died relatively young in the 1980s, and she died very controversially. Many people believe Carl Andre, the artist, was responsible for her death. She fell from an apartment where they were living, and many people think that he was the one who killed her. He claimed that she committed suicide, essentially, or fell. Anyways, she would have definitely continued to create very important work. Again, she engaged her body in her work. She definitely was thinking about the Great Mother, creative forces, women's forces. Here we see her engaging her body using Untitled facial hair transplant, the mustache. Here you see her Untitled Blood and Feathers, again, engaging her body. She would often recreate kind of crime scenes or assault scenes or rape scenes early on. Here you see her work Untitled from 1973. Here you see her Tree of Life. She begins exploring this particular pose with her arms raised, kind of connecting the earth and the heavens and the female role in doing that. These series, however, of course, are only commemorated in films and photographs. These were all ephemeral works. These are things that we cannot commemorate really in exhibitions unless through photography or through film. She had a particular series called the Silueta series where she would leave behind these silhouettes through various, like mud, as we see here, other types of natural materials. And again, these were forms that weren't going to last. They were ephemeral, and so they would have them on display, or they would be created by Anna and then photographed and then recalled only through those means. And it's important to think about this is when land art is very significant with figures like Smithson. And so just thinking about how she's engaging with the earth, but really bringing the idea of a powerful feminine or mother goddess to the fore. The last subject I'd like to talk about in relation to female artists and feminism is murals. And this is because muralism became quite popular in the 1970s as a means for bringing together communities and also a way to bring new voices into the art world. And also the idea of public art, art that is accessible to all, art that you don't have to go into a museum to see. And traditionally, muralists were often men. This idea of it's very physical, it's a big project, you're outside. And so there were women who wanted to get into this practice. And so in San Francisco, you had a group called Las Mujeres Muralistas. And this was a group that started off as a few co-founders and then grew from there. Many women wanted to get involved. And they created some very striking murals, particularly in the Mission District. This is a district that historically has had a lot of immigrants with Latino heritage or connections to Central and South America. And so here you see their mural, Latino America, on Mission Street between 25th and 26th from the 1970s. Again, engaging with themes, colors, subjects that would be considered significant for those in the Mission District. I mean, today the Mission District is really losing a lot of its heritage because it has become heavily gentrified and become a popular place for tech workers to live because it's in the southern part of San Francisco, so they can easily commute down from San Francisco down to the area of San Jose. So this heritage, this Latino heritage, is being lost. But in this scene, you can see the importance of family, particular costume, the idea of the maíz, the corn, these particular plants that seem to remind those looking at this of the homeland, of this kind of longing perhaps of the homeland, which is so common among immigrant communities. Representations of the sun, and again, different generations, different styles of dress being brought together in a single image. Here you see the group together, or some from the group. Graciela Carrillo and Patricia Rodriguez were important early members. We also see Consuelo Mendez and Irene Perez. Unfortunately, or Irene Perez, unfortunately, these particular figures, this is something that we continue to need more research about because there aren't the kind of numerous number of art history books about this subject as there are on other artists, other male artists, for example. And murals with city development are often sometimes the first ones to go. They also created this Fantasy for Children mural from 1975. And the way they explained this one was that it was something for children. It was supposed to be positive, really bright and engaging colors. But in addition to that, this was a time when a lot of men were coming back from Vietnam, especially Latino men. So men who had been to Vietnam, had been through the trauma of this war, and were coming back with a very negative outlook. You know, they had been through this horrible experience in the war. And so Las Mujeres Muralistas, the women muralists, they hadn't necessarily been through that. They're bringing a more positive outlook to the Mission District, something that can be, something that can inspire the community. All right, the final stop is a Great Wall in Los Angeles, or known as the Great Wall of Los Angeles, but its technical title is The History of California. This is put up along a tributary of the LA River, and it's apparently the longest mural in the world. At this point, it's over, I think, a third of a mile long. Oh, well, it's almost 3,000 feet at this point. So it really keeps growing and is getting longer and longer because they continue to want to expand it. It was begun in 1976, and again, Judy Baca, or Judith Baca, was really the mastermind of this work, but it involved many, many artists and also hundreds of students and hundreds of people to help create this vision. So it involves the Olympics in Los Angeles from 1984. It involves history that doesn't really shy away from race issues in LA, so that's really important. Just to show you one example of a close-up here, you can see Dust Bowl refugees, the idea of the Great Depression. So it's really tracking this kind of history and these people that are coming to Los Angeles and coming to California. And of course, it's doing it in such a large way, again, really involving the public and also teaching the public history and exploring areas that they might not see again at a museum, but they're seeing it in a public space. Murals, of course, need a lot of upkeep and a lot of care because there's a lot of exposure to the elements, but many people feel like they're some of the best ways to look at art because, again, they're available to all. In Los Angeles, especially in East LA, there was a strong tradition of muralists. There were male muralists, Los Four, also Judith Hernandez. So there was a tradition of muralists who were working in LA. And this tradition, of course, continues, but was especially strong right around this time.